Well, welcome everybody to the Johnson Center, the Hoover Institution's outpost in Washington, D.C. My name's Adam White. I'm a research fellow at the Hoover Institution. And today it's my great pleasure to welcome Senator Chuck Grassley to join us today for a conversation on American constitutionalism in Congress. Iowans elected Chuck Grassley to the Senate in 1980. In his 37 years as a senator, and before that, 6 more years in the House of Representatives, Senator Grassley has established himself as a proponent and an exemplar of Congress's role as our Constitution's first branch in terms of both legislation and oversight. He currently chairs both the Senate Judiciary Committee and the Senate Caucus on Narcotics, is that correct? An issue of increasing national import. He previously chaired the Senate Finance Committee and its Committee on Aging. And next year, upon the retirement of Senator Orrin Hatch, he'll be the Senate's senior-most Republican. Our talk today is part of a Hoover Institution series titled Opening Arguments, Conversations on American Constitutionalism. One of the points of this series is to encourage us all to think about American constitutionalism beyond the courts and to focus on the other branches of government and the states and, in James Madison's famous words, the people themselves. In that spirit, I can think of no one better suited to join us today in this conversation than Senator Grassley. Please join me in welcoming Senator, let me begin with the broadest possible question. What are the Senate's most important roles in our constitutional system?
Well, I usually talk to a high school class and I'd say it's probably passing laws, appropriating money, and that's what most people think that's what we do. Levy taxes, of course, but legislation. But I always like to add that checks and balances of government. I consider oversight a very important function of Congress because it's our job to make sure that a president does, according to what the Constitution says, faithfully execute the laws. And from that standpoint, it's even more important today when over the last 80 years, Congress has delegated so much power to the executive branch of government or to independent agencies that we do the oversight role. And I actually feel quite proper in saying that most members of Congress like to get credit for passing bills, and I like to do that too. But I think more important function is to make sure that what Congress says in laws or how money should be spent, that the President of the United States, whether he's a Republican or Democrat, do exactly that, and that Congress doesn't do enough oversight, spend all their time on other things.
Well, has this changed much in your time in the Senate, the way that the Senate's handled its oversight role, or have things been on a pretty consistent trajectory?
I don't know whether, except for myself, that I can really answer your question for 99 other senators. But I do believe that there is not enough oversight, not enough people pay attention to it. And I always advocate that to particularly new members of Congress, because I like to say to new members of Congress, you know, around here it takes at least 50 votes to get a bill passed, and sometimes it takes 60 votes, and now more than ever it takes 60 votes to get something done. Remember, you don't have to have 51 votes to do oversight. You only need 1 vote. You need your own vote. So I always advocate people that that's a very important responsibility, and they ought to do it in any way that they can, whether it's a letter, whether it's a speech on the floor, whether it's commentaries to editors, or you know, through your committee or whatever you can do. The only advantage for somebody that's been in office as long as I have been, when you get to be a more senior member, get to be chairman of a committee, it seems to me like you got more resources and you have maybe more quote-unquote power, whatever that is in this town, to maybe get respect for your requests. But yeah, I still get pushed around every day about oversight. Don't get the cooperation we're promised. You know, when these new cabinet people come to the Hill and they want you kind of interview them in your office, because maybe it's in the committees that we serve and have jurisdiction over them, and they come and we always ask them, are you going to answer your letters? Are you going to come and testify? Are you going to cooperate with us on oversight? Every one of them says yes. And in the last few years, maybe the last 3 or 4 years, I've come to the conclusion I'm going to help them not be liars. I say to them, you really ought to answer maybe.
When I'm not here at the Hoover Institution, I'm across the river teaching administrative law. And one of the things I try to impress upon the students is the way that agencies are changing so much in their relationship to Congress, right? Agencies for so long have been delegated broad powers, but it seems to me that now more and more the agencies are becoming ever less responsive to Congress. Am I wrong about that? Or?
No, you're absolutely right. And obviously the 100% responsibility for that rests with how liberally or loosely Congress has written legislation to delegate authority. But also, I would put, particularly since the Chevron case, I would say that some blame rests with the courts for giving too much deference. I know why that was done in the sense of, well, somebody like the President of the United States is selected by the people and judges aren't selected by the people, that maybe somebody that's responsible to an elected official ought to have more deference than judges have. But I think they've loosened it up, so not only do they have more leeway, but they can actually do things that the law doesn't allow. Like, for instance, putting two provisions together in the Clean Air Act that were never put together in the recently court case before the Supreme Court, where it really wasn't decided on the merits of it. So that question really wasn't asked, but deep down through a process, it was overturned 5-4. I think that was the last decision Scalia wrote before he died, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Right, this is the Clean Power Plan.
Yeah, I think that's the name of it, yeah.
Now, the Supreme Court has said that Chevron deference is based on, it's supposed to reflect Congress, the court's assumptions about what Congress wants the courts to do. So you can change Chevron if you like.
Well,
something for you to consider.
Yeah, Senator Hatch has a bill in to do that.
Yeah.
Does some other things too, but I'm a co-sponsor of that bill, and it should pass. But you know, with liberals wanting unelected bureaucrats to have all this authority, it's going to be pretty difficult to get 60 votes on that in the United States Senate until there's outrage over something on the left that some commission's done that they don't like, I think.
Then they'll become much less deferential.
Yeah.
You know, you had mentioned at the beginning legislation, appropriations, and oversight.
Confirmations too. I should have.
That's true.
But that's a function of the Senate, not the House.
Right, and I do want to get back to confirmations. It's been such an important issue. But I do want to just touch briefly on appropriations and oversight. Right, those two, they're separate, but they're also conjoined in many ways. Right, James Madison said that the power of the purse is the most effective tool the people have to arm themselves against the overreaches of other parts of government. And so the power of the purse seems to be one of the two main tools in Congress's toolbox to actually put weight behind the oversight process. I mean, do you see those two things as...
It's changed a lot in recent years.
How's that?
Through continuing resolutions and what you call omnibus appropriation bills. It seems like whether the Democrats are in the majority or minority, it seems like they like it when you get down to shutting down government. And usually under separate appropriation bills, there used to be a lot of restrictions on the enforcement of regulation, carrying out regulations by saying none of the money in this appropriation bill can be used to carry out such and such regulation. And that would be some discipline, probably a more certain discipline than changing the law or you know, going to court and all that stuff. But in recent years, you know, like I think last year or 2 years ago, I think I identified 25 attempts by mostly conservatives, I suppose, to put restrictions on the enforcement of various laws. Some of them get through, but they always become a bargaining chip at the last minute, and most of them are thrown out because you know, only Republicans get blamed for shutting down government. Democrats never get blamed for shutting down government. So that makes us a little nervous about how much you push for some of these things. and consequently, we don't get as many of them through as we should. But that's the most effective way. That's a very effective way. I don't want to say it's the best way, but it's about the only way you can do it.
Well, and the point you said earlier that there, we used to have multiple appropriations bills every year, and now it comes down to the omnibus. That really does sort of limit the opportunity for Congress to use the power of the purse as a tool. Is that right?
Yeah. Now, 2 years ago, we were going to have some sort of an agreement with the Democrats in December that the next year we're going to do these separate appropriation bills. It doesn't materialize. I think then we had a second year of a promise. Now we got a third year of a promise. The subcommittees are going to start meeting in May to make some decisions. We'll see if we can make that work out. But I would guess that the game's going to continue to be played, particularly that the Democrats don't control the Congress now or the presidency.
Okay, let's talk a little bit about appointments. You mentioned that, and that's also obviously one of the most important responsibilities the Senate has, especially when it comes to judicial appointments. It's something you've been in the middle of for years now. And interestingly, especially now that you chair the Senate Judiciary Committee, you're not a lawyer. Which is not a bad thing at all.
First non-lawyer in the history of the Senate to be chairman of this committee.
Right, and some criticized you as you were taking over the chairmanships. They complained that you were a non-lawyer.
Yeah.
And obviously,
a guy who wanted to be my colleague in the United States Senate lost the election when he told a bunch of lawyers, if you don't elect me, Grassley's chairman of the committee, you'll have a non-lawyer. Or no, he said you'll have a farmer for chairman of the committee.
Right. We have a friend named Gary Schmidt at the American Enterprise Institute. He said in the New York Times a few years ago, the Constitution is too important to be left to the lawyers.
Okay.
And so it falls to folks like you in the Senate, the non-lawyers who are taking care of this. And anyway, as a non-lawyer and as somebody who plays a central role in the confirmation process, how do you go about the process of evaluating judicial nominations? What are you looking for?
Okay.
What are you looking for in the process?
Well, first of all, I think before we ever get involved, I think you got to look at, there's probably 50 different ways to do it for 50 different states. I used to do it one way when Senator Harkin was my colleague. We got along very well on this issue, depending on whether we had a Republican or Democrat president. We just accepted each other's approach. I have a commission now with Senator Ernst that has lawyers interview anybody that wants to apply for a judgeship. Other states, sometimes maybe just some senior senator decides, I want Joe Blow or Mary Smith to be on the court. But then you go through that process in 50 different ways, and then it goes to the White House, and they interview everybody and give them, and you have the FBI, and then we get the nominee, and the FBI report up to us. We grant 28 days for both Republican and minority to do it. In the meantime, we send out a 40 or 50-page questionnaire to them, that they have to fill out, and we go through that, go through the FBI report, and then we have the hearing. Usually every other Wednesday we have at least one circuit judge and 4 district judges. We try to. Once in a while we'll have a couple circuit judges, and then sometimes the White House doesn't get the names up to us fast enough, so we don't have a full thing. But my plan is every Tuesday, every other Wednesday, to have at least one circuit and 4 district judges. We got 33 on the calendar now. I think 35 on the calendar that's waiting to be processed on the Senate floor. We have about 30 or so that have come up from the White House that are in this 28-day process of going through them. And you're asking me, what do we look for? I can tell you what I look for,
please.
But sometimes I think that all the Democrats look for, well, is he got anything to do with the Federalist Society? Because if you got something to do with the Federalist Society, you surely can't be on any court. You can't be impartial, So I look for judicial temperance, somebody that's going to look at the law and the facts of the case and leave their own personal views out. I don't think that's naive to think so, because I think that as I look at what Senator Harkin proposed in Iowa and what I proposed in Iowa, I think whether you got liberal or conservatives, I think that's the kind of people we get at the district court level. They seem to be so bound by circuit precedent and Supreme Court precedent, they don't have a lot of leeway. So if they just leave their personal views out of it, I think it's going to happen, what I said. You rely just a little bit on ABA's judgment, but it's not going to be dispositive. You look at their records as either a previous judge in the state courts, or you look at their writings. And most of these people come with plenty of information to judge them by. And I've never looked at somebody that in a Democrat administration that was active in the ACLU that they shouldn't be on the courts. And then I get this lately from Democrats on my committee that they're concerned that there might not be balance in a particular circuit. See, well, I think that's intellectually dishonest from this standpoint. That I want balance too, and I think we're going to get balance. When you have 8 years of a Democrat president, 8 years of a Republican president, history's going to take care of the balance.
Yeah. I would love to see some balance on the Ninth Circuit. I'm all in favor of that if you want to look into that.
I'd rather split it up.
Well, I know a lot of people would like to split it up. But on the judicial nominations, famously at the Supreme Court nominations, but also in some of the circuit court nominations, they've become the forum for some of the most heated and controversial moments in the Senate now. Those hearings, beginning, almost 30 years ago with Robert Bork and Justice Thomas, and now through to today, all the way to some of the most recent circuit court nominations. It's like so much of our political angst and controversy becomes focused in this hearing about a particular nominee and his or her vision of the Constitution. And wrapped up in all of that is the process of cloture votes and blue slips and all of these things. And you've seen in your time in the Senate so much change around just the hearing and the process that gives rise to the hearing. I mean, looking back in hindsight, what are your sort of reflections on how all this has played out since Bork?
Well, first of all, on the blue slip, because I'm being accused of throwing away the blue slip, but we haven't thrown away. I announced we're going to keep the blue slip. Out of 18 chairmen of the committee in the 100-year-old history of the blue slip, there's always been some exceptions, except in the case of two chairmen of the committee, Eastland on the one hand and Leahy on the other hand. And otherwise, there's always been some exceptions. So there's probably more, from my point of view, there's more exceptions to the blue slip when it's a multi-state like circuits are, because what we don't do in one state affects the workload of the judges from the other states.
You mean, like, so for example, the 8th Circuit covers Iowa and Minnesota, so there's more than one state.
Yeah, or I use the example of, back in the period of time, 2004, 5, and 6, there was a whole lot of vacancies on the 6th Circuit. It was, you might say, well, it was legitimate for the Michigan senator or senators to hold up somebody that they didn't like from Michigan going on that court, but it was carried over to the fact that when you had 2 blue slips returned by 2 Republican senators to support it, then the chairman of the committee didn't even go ahead with those 2 that had the blue slips already returned. So that's why there's some exception to it, but I think it's pretty conclusive to me in the case of district court judges and U.S. attorneys and marshals, but some more apt to be more exception. So I got to apologize. I kind of lost track of where you were wanting me to go.
I mean, in your time in the Senate, right?
Oh,
we'll say
okay.
The hearings for O'Connor and
now
the early justices.
Now I know where you're going.
Well, I'm interested in where you're going.
But you got me back on track now because I took too long to explain blue slip problems.
Yeah.
Anyway, I think Bork taught everybody since then, don't try to educate the Senate. I mean, he was so thorough in his answers, it probably destroyed his attempt to be on the court. And then, of course, thank God Ginsburg comes along, and she says, I'm not going to answer that question because it might come before the courts. And so now we have some judges today, and Democrats don't like that. But the Ginsburg rule ought to, if it's good for one person, it ought to be good for the other. So I think things were pretty much Bork was mistreated, obviously. He should have been on the court. He had unanimous ABA approval, and then they got political when he wanted to go on the Supreme Court. So that kind of ruins some of our taste for relying on the ABA, you know, totally. We still entertain them. So I'd like to look at the history of it this way. To answer your question, I believe I'm getting back to your question, is that except for Fortas, I believe that there's no Supreme Court justice that was filibustered, and he really wasn't filibustered because he only had 48 votes to begin with. So, but let's accept that until 2002. And then I think Schumer and Tribe and others felt, well, we're going to do something because Bush stole this election from us. So we're going to be very, very tough. And so for the first time in the history of our country, we're going to put ideology. What's your ideology? Like today, if you're a Federalist, you obviously got some ideology. You can't be an impartial judge, see? So then you, I kind of look at it this way, that that's what changed everything. You know, when Estrada goes through 7 votes, right. Because why? Because, well, Republicans can't get the credit for putting a Hispanic on the D.C. Circuit because he might get on the Supreme Court, and only Democrats can get credit for putting a Hispanic on the Supreme Court. But that carried through. So that during the first term of Bush's administration, that, or through the Bush administration, that kind of poisoned the water towards Republicans. It carried over to Obama. I'd love to sit down with Democrats and say, when are we going to get back to kind of what Hatch tried to do? We had the Bork nomination, then we had the Thomas nomination. It was very disruptive to the whole process. So Hatch said, you know, let's get back where we're looking at these people for what they are. That's why Breyer and Ginsburg got overwhelmingly approved. Right. And then all of a sudden comes along the Schumer speech up in Philadelphia, and he changes all that. Right. See?
Do you see much hope for the process going back to what Hatch had in mind? Or?
If I'll lead the way if the Democrats are serious about doing that.
What else, in terms of the way the Senate goes about its work today? I mean, I'm sorry to be blunt, but not a whole lot of legislation comes out of Congress anymore. And the appropriations process. 400
bills pass the House, but then the Senate, the Senate's not doing anything. Well, we're spending all our time on Democrat filibusters of judges that get through 97 to 1.
Well, what prospects are there for reform, do you think?
Good. The Rules Committee today is going to meet and bring out the Lankford approach that will limit debate, except for cabinet people and Supreme Court and circuit judges, to 2 hours on other nominees. Post-filibuster.
The Lankford approach.
Yeah.
Okay.
And it's going to get out of committee, and I think we'll have the votes to get it passed. And it isn't anything different than what every Democrat voted for in 2012 when they passed a similar temporary rule that lasted till the end of the Congress, and then it left. And we will do the same thing, but I guess we're not going to get any Democrat support. You know, it makes a difference whether you have a Republican president or a Democrat and how you ought to decide something as a senator, right?
Well, I guess so. Well, we're talking about the rules, though. How much of the current sort of holdup in the Senate and the legislative process is a question of formal rules and process, and how much of it is just a question of the political culture today, not just in Congress, but in general? I mean, it seems the country as a whole oftentimes is sort of gridlocked on policy. How much of this can be changed through rules, and how much of it is a broader conversation about how we as Americans relate to one another in these policy debates?
Well, if you expect Congress to be representative of the grassroots of America, and you see that the country's blue on both coasts and red in the middle, wouldn't you expect that to be reflected in the Congress of the United States? Yeah. So this is something I got to teach almost every town meeting that I have. You know, why don't you guys get along? That's the question I get from Iowans. Then you got to kind of explain how we're divided. 30 years ago, CBS, NBC, ABC controlled 80% of the news. Now they control about 20%, and there isn't a political view that can't get out in MSNBC, Fox News, right and left, and you got all the talk shows right and left, and you got the internet and the social networking. There's not a political view that can't get out today, and it gets out, and it influences people, and it's divided us.
And we have an entire channel devoted to history.
But on the, yeah. They need to change the name of that channel. See. Anyway, I think that from the standpoint of the House of Representatives, the rules govern. But in the United States Senate, I think it's more precedent and what people can do by consensus.
Well, you talked about the town hall meetings, and we'll go to audience questions in just a minute, but I'd like to focus on this because we were chatting outside a little bit about education and civics education and what they teach or don't teach in schools. And you're going back to Iowa, where you still farm, right?
Yeah. My son Robin, he want me to tell you, he does all the work.
And what part of what town is the farm in again?
New Hartford, 10 miles west of Cedar Falls, Iowa, where the University of Northern Iowa is, and I live within 4 miles of the farmhouse I was born in 84 years ago.
And you went to UNI? Right?
Yeah.
As a Hawkeye, I won't hold it against you.
Yeah. You wouldn't dare.
But so you go back to the town halls and you're dealing with Americans every day. You're talking about these issues and the way that they see their government and the things that they do or they know or were never taught about government. How have the expectations of the voters changed in all this time? I mean, you've seen entire 2 generations of voters be educated or not educated, and now they're coming to you as their representative.
You know what? I think what I see in Iowa is still a lot of history and government being taught. I'm worried more about the big cities and the big school districts of Iowa, of the United States. I wouldn't say that there's as much of it in Iowa as should be, but I make a point of going, I'll bet at least 15 high schools a year. And it seems to me I talk to kids that understand a little bit how our government works. Maybe not as much of history, but heavens, I learned 100 times history after I got out of high school than what I learned in high school, and that was 60 years ago. Yeah.
We'll only put in a plug for Dubuque Wahlert High School. They did a good job with us.
Yeah.
With that, let's there's a couple of audience microphones. We'll take questions. Raise your hand. I'll call on a couple people at a time. Please, in the Jeopardy rule, please phrase your statement in the form of a question. We'll start here, and then anybody else over here? Okay, well, we'll start over here, and then the next one will be right here. Yes, sir.
Alex Abu Hussein, no affiliation. But Alex Abu Hussein, my name, and no affiliation. Senator knows me, I go to all your hearings. Speaking of oversight, do you limit your committee to being reactive, or could be, how to say this, before the damage is done, proactive, since a law enforcement could be targeting somebody with physical harm? Thank you.
Yeah. I would say most oversight tends to be reactive. There's so much that can be oversighted that the ones that are brought to your attention are probably somewhat after the damage is done. But what you try to do through oversight, like if the situation is you're investigating something, it's like locking the barn door after the horse has been stolen, you hope to set an environment so that doesn't happen again. It's sometimes very difficult to correct a wrong through oversight.
How do you set that kind of environment?
I think just vigorously pursuing what you do. I think I have a good reputation on oversight, and I think that whistleblowers trust me. I think investigative journalists trust me, and when they're working with you, it makes you more effective. If people read about their problems in the paper and they don't want a lot of publicity about it, it helps you get answers, things of that nature. Being chairman of a committee helps a lot, more than if you're just an individual senator. When this president came out, well, I shouldn't say this president came out, but some of his people said that we're not going to answer any letters to members of Congress except chairmen of committees. Well, they're saying 80% of the Senate can't get answers to letters on oversight. So I wrote a 7 or 8 page letter to the White House Counsel, and they backed down on that point, see.
Well, can we focus on that for just a second? I don't mean to delay audience questions, but so much of what we discuss oftentimes comes down to Republicans versus Democrats. But this is interesting because here you have a Republican administration and a Republican Congress not seeing eye to eye on this. And I'm just curious, the advantage that a president has is that there's one president, right? It's the unitary executive. In Congress, you have, well, in the Senate, you have 100 senators, all with their own constituencies, their own interests. How do senators come to think of themselves institutionally as senators, right, with interests in the institution regardless of their partisan affiliation? Do enough senators do this, or is there too much?
I think it's more done in the Senate than in the House because, a majority Republican or Democrat in the House, they can ignore the minority. But when you have this 60-vote rule, you can't ignore the minority. So there's got to be some collegiality or you'll never get anything done.
That's true.
The only thing I've observed about oversight and collegiality, when I'm taking on a Republican president, when I don't want to take on the president, but
right.
There's something wrong in that president's administrative branch of government you're overseeing. I get a lot of help from Democrats, but when we have a Democrat president and I'm an equal opportunity overseer, and I go after something's wrong in the Democrat administration, I don't seem to get the same help.
Yeah. Well, we'll go to our next question here, and then did you have your hand up? And the next question here.
Senator, thank you for being here. My name is Mike Stern. I'm a former congressional lawyer. I want to ask you a question about the special counsel bill
Sure.
that your committee is taking up. As you know, there are the questions about the constitutionality of certain issues about that bill, but I want to ask you a slightly broader question, which is whether you're concerned that the focus solely on Mr. Mueller's investigation, which deals with criminal accountability, tends to push out the Congress and the Senate's broader oversight responsibility in terms of the policy issues that may come out of this investigation, issues of government accountability that might not be criminal in nature. Do you have any concerns along those lines, and could you respond to that?
Yeah. It does it from this standpoint, and I don't know whether this is narrow or a big issue. I mean, you can't really tell right now. But it comes down to basically that when we want some information or to interview somebody or to have somebody for a hearing, if it's going to in any way interfere with the special counsel, that tends to preempt it. But I think only in that way. Otherwise, we can do everything on oversight that we want to do, but that's something you take into consideration. And in some areas it's been an impediment. I think maybe more for the intelligence committees than for my committee. We're a little more narrow in our oversight of the Department of Justice, but we're into it too. But it seems like the intelligence committee, it might affect them more. Yeah.
By the way, I saw a news report this morning about a proposal to change the reporting obligations for special counsels. To give more reports to Congress on the status of investigations.
Yeah, that's in an amendment that I'm going to tomorrow try to get added to this bill.
Yeah. Could you just talk about it a little bit?
Well, it's first of all, getting back to his questioning, we had a hearing on this last fall, and we had constitutional experts on one side and on the other. So really it boiled down to kind of this. There was 2 bills in. I said, I'm not going to mess around with 2 bills. If you can't get together and do it in a bipartisan way, I'm not going to put it on the agenda. So almost 6 months passed. Nothing happened. Then they get together. So I feel, to keep my word to my colleagues, even though I would raise questions about the constitutionality, I'm going to put it on the agenda. So that's why we have it on the agenda for tomorrow. And then with my amendment, I don't see it interfering in any way with what they're trying to accomplish through this bipartisan bill. I see it as an add-on, and it's just to keep on top of it and maybe stop some of the abuses. Well, what's wrong with knowing where you're going? What's your assignment? And you shouldn't go outside of your assignment. If you're going outside of your assignment, why are you doing it? Or if the facts lead you from where you were going to be narrowly focused to something broader, then what's wrong with knowing where the facts lead you? And is it within your charter?
Right, especially when we're talking about an office which, whether by statute or by Justice Department regulations, is already being insulated from
Yeah.
the normal accountability. There was another question here.
Sure. Senator Grassley, thank you for being here, for your leadership. You said earlier that there was a problem, as you said, with liberals who think that unelected bureaucrats ought to have all the power. And I wonder what you think people ought to be doing to highlight what may be one of the most fundamental differences now between the two coalitions in Congress. One that thinks the people ought to have the final say, and the other thinks that bureaucrats ought to basically dictate the rules without the consent of folks. And I know you've been enthusiastic about the concept of the Reins Act, and before the meeting we did briefly discuss the Regulation Freedom Amendment, which is a constitutional version of the Reins Act. It's been endorsed by the RNC with the blessing of the White House. What are your thoughts on how we can promote this issue of unelected bureaucrats versus the people in terms of setting rules?
Number one, and most importantly, write legislation that delegates less authority to the agencies, less power to them in the first place, because that's when the horse gets out of the barn, difficult to get back in. Then, I'm one that argued what was eventually became unconstitutional through the Chadha Act. I believe that Congress, when we have sole legislative power, that we feel that maybe we can't make a final decision on this, so we kind of think that somebody else can fill in some details. The problem is we let them fill in too many details, but as narrowly as you can fill in the details, then we ought to have something to say about that, since we gave that power away in the first place. Now, obviously, Chadha says otherwise, but get back to that point. So that brings us to the Reins Act, and I'm very much a supporter of it, but we probably won't get the 60 votes to get it passed. It gets through the House fairly easily in a Republican House. But this, at least in some of the most important rules, anything that has a cost of more than $100 million on a cost-benefit ratio would have to be given to us, and we would have a fast track, so it wouldn't be subject to the 60-vote margin, and we would have to give final approval to it. When you're dealing with legislation that takes scientific determination, and it's legitimate to legislate something, or something through the FCC that has to be studied from a standpoint of technicality to get it done. Let's say net neutrality. It was going to be handled probably in a legitimate way until Obama said to the FCC, I want net neutrality. Then politics played it. It wasn't the impartial thing that these independent agencies ought to be sued. So right now I'd have to say the Reins Act. See, the second to that would be making it easier to put these riders on appropriation bills.
Could you expand on that a little bit?
The latter one?
Yeah.
Or the reins?
No, well, about
Well, when I say make it easier,
Yeah.
it seems to me that if we go through this legislative process of not having an omnibus bill and getting down to the point of squeeze on you got to get something done in the next 24 hours, and you handle the individual appropriation bills and they get out to the Senate on the Senate floor for debate as a separate bill, it's a lot easier to get those regulations curbed through riders on appropriation bills.
Now, in addition to the Reins Act, which I agree would be a very sort of useful way to, across the board, undelegate power back from the agencies. And there's also calls to reform the agency process, right? I know this isn't your
Well,
committee.
since 1946, I don't know whether the APA's ever been looked at.
Those parts haven't. That's
So you ought to get a review of the Administrative Procedures Act. And then within that process, I think Chevron's the most important issue that I can identify. If you can identify some others, I'd comment on them.
Oh, I'm full of ideas, but
Okay.
I think you've just you've covered the high note.
Well, I got a list here that I should have looked at before I answered your question. Besides the overview of the APA and Chevron, and then greater stop the abuse of cost benefit that went on in the last administration. Now, maybe it's been abused in a lot of administrations, but there's no doubt about it that there wasn't any regulation coming out of the previous administration didn't have a positive cost benefit. And the Clean Power Act would have been one of these, because they didn't even take that into consideration, is the way I read the court case. And then another abuse is this sue to settle.
Yeah.
That's got to be done away with.
I mean, the administration has taken action. They've issued executive orders on some of these things, not all of these things. You talked a little bit ago about the independent commissions. On the one hand, Congress is counting on the independent agencies, the independent commissions, to have real expertise and deliberation in the multi-member body. On the other hand, there's always been virtue in making sure that all parts of the administrative apparatus are accountable to the president. This administration hasn't issued an executive order on sort of roping in independent agencies. And I know we're kind of ranging far afield, but if I may, do you have any thoughts on
Well,
how should do that?
I have some differences with Pruitt on ethanol, but there's one place where he really took a lead, and that's on this sue to settle.
Yep.
He put out a directive to his administration, and so I wrote him and I said, you need to bring this up at the cabinet meetings and get every one of the cabinet positions to do exactly what you did for EPA. Because you can't have people negotiating behind the scenes and then get court approval of it, and then there's no input like the Administrative Procedures Act implies.
Right. Well, the House has proposed some good bills on this, and hopefully they'll get wrapped up into the Senate's work. Do we have any other audience questions? Please, right here. The microphone is coming behind you.
Senator Grassley, I'm Dan Berinsky. I'm so appreciative for you being here. Do you think it would increase the collegiality if they reinstituted, now I forgot, on appropriations bills where you say, well, earmarks and appropriations bills, which they eliminated? Do you think it'd be good to return having earmarks?
No.
Would that increase?
Well, yeah, but, I think earmarks, when they started out, were pretty good when you had a few dozen or maybe a few hundred. When this became an issue in the 2010 election, like the Bridge to Nowhere, which probably had some legitimacy, but just the name itself, what that did to the whole argument for earmarks. We had 13,000 that year. Go from a few hundred to 13,000. And I don't mean when you have political determination when a senator or a congressman does something that project is just automatically bad, but there is some political influence in it. And is it done for political reasons or is it done for the rationale behind it? I suppose most anything you'd say, well, it's doing something good, but so here, we're still having those projects funded, but they're being determined by non-political people, bureaucracies. Now that's once removed from the people of the country, but then you see when you do something just strictly because Congress can do it, isn't moving to 13,000 earmarks a little outrageous?
We have time for one more audience question. Please. The microphone's coming behind you.
Hi, Senator. Good to see you. My question is about the collapse of norms in the Senate and the lack of collegiality, and the filibuster is the best illustration of this, that you had a long-time tradition of not having a filibuster on judicial nominations, and as we know, it was legally permitted but never exercised, even in the Fortis case. I agree with your nuanced view of the history there. I guess my question is, do you see partners on the Democratic side to try to, we're never going to go backwards, but to establish a new set of norms that are more collegial and more respectful of looking across the aisle and trying to respect how people can get along on different opinions? Or do you see this same divergence in the body continuing, which you alluded to earlier, so that you're going to have a brighter red and a brighter blue, and those who work hard to get 65 or 70% of the vote back in Iowa, as you did in each of your elections in the past, that's just not going to happen anymore. I'm kind of curious about your optimism of finding partners to establish a new set of norms that are a little more productive, I guess I should say.
Okay, let me say that probably it's going to continue as is for a few years, but let me, from the two statements that have been made here about collegiality, I want to add that senators face-to-face are not less civil than they've ever been, as far as in the 37 years I've been in the Senate. I don't think in just dealing person to person, people aren't less civil. They're very civil. It comes from pressures outside, I think. The base of parties being more extreme left, extreme right. And I think it's what modern communications, social networking, all the talk shows, all the Foxes and the MSNBCs contribute to it. And for instance, why would all but 3 Democrats tomorrow vote against Pompeo when he got a lot of Democrat votes to be CIA? It's you're not a loyal Democrat, and you might be primaried if you don't go along with this extreme. And the Republicans have the same thing to some extent, see. So particularly from those, and it'd probably be 85% of the Republicans, think Trump is 100% in the right track, see. So you got to take that into consideration and how that is impacted through modern communication rather than just ABC, NBC, and CBS, as it was 30 years ago. So you want me to be able to tell you how it's going to change? I think
partners on the left.
I think Senator Baucus and Senator Grassley demonstrated for 11 years how we ran the committee. He was left, but not very far left. I'm probably not the most extreme right Republican senator. Cooperation, the working relationships of committees, staff, as much as what we did, but we set the tone for it. Another thing about the Judiciary Committee that is more ideologically divided, but in the years 15 and 16, we voted 31 bills out of committee that were bipartisan, and 18 of them got to a Democrat president. So I try to demonstrate, I think, that what you want to change how the Senate operates, it starts with each individual senator. What can Chuck Grassley do to make the Senate function better? That's not really answering your question, but passing a law, I don't think passing a rule is going to do it.
Well, Senator, we know your time visiting us is short, and we appreciate it all. On behalf of the Hoover Institution, which, by the way, is the only think tank named after an Iowan, I do want to say thank you very much for joining us. So thanks, everybody, and welcome back to this morning's discussion on Congress and our constitutional system. We thought it would be good to follow up Senator Grassley's conversation with a broader discussion of some of the folks who are working on these issues at think tanks around town. And so I really could not have assembled a better panel to discuss these things. And so we'll proceed down the line in this order, but if I may just briefly introduce our speakers. Sitting to my left is Molly Reynolds. She's a fellow in governance studies at the Brookings Institution, where she studies Congress with an emphasis on how congressional rules and procedures affect domestic policy outcomes. She's the author of a book, Exceptions to the Rule, The Politics of Filibuster Limitations in the U.S. Senate, which explores the creation, use, and consequences of the budget reconciliation process and other procedures which prevent filibusters in the Senate. And also at Brookings, she oversees its annual study, Vital Statistics on Congress. It sounds like a rip-roaring read.
It's great.
Sitting next to her is Kevin Kosar. He is Vice President for Policy at the R Street Institute, where he oversees all of R Street's research, and he co-directs the Institute's nonpartisan Legislative Branch Capacity Working Group, which aims to strengthen Congress, or as the hat that you didn't bring this time says, make Congress great again. Before joining R Street, he was an analyst and research manager for the Congressional Research Service, the Congress's in-house research organization. And I have to say, in addition to all of his policy work, he's written books on whiskey and moonshine, and he maintains a blog dedicated to fishing in the greater D.C. area, which makes him, quite frankly, the greatest Washingtonian of all. And then finally, seated to his left is Yuval Levin. Yuval is the Vice President of the Ethics and Public Policy Center, and the founding editor of National Affairs, the nation's leading quarterly journal on policy and American Constitutionalism. And I want to add that because the new issue...
It's what we call a low bar, by the way, but thank you.
True. The new issue is packed with not just policy analysis, including Kevin's colleagues, C. Jarrett Dieterle and Shoshana Weissman on licensing, but there's essays on patriotism, on academia, and on the legacies of Herb Storing and
Martin
Diamond, two great constitutional thinkers of the 1970s. So I highly recommend, if you haven't already seen this issue, that you pick it up in particular. In addition to national affairs and the EPPC, before joining EPPC, Yuval was executive director of President Bush's Council on Bioethics, later co-founded another journal, The New Atlantis, focused on technology and society. He writes widely on domestic policy, he writes books, and so on and so on. And so with that, let's just begin a very broad discussion. We'll start with Molly. Molly, what's your sense of Congress today, what it's getting right and what it's not getting right?
Thank you, Adam, and thank you all for coming and for having me. I have to say that Senator Grassley really set me up very nicely with his answer to the last question for what I want to use my time to talk about today, which is, it's really helpful that I'm going first because I want to give us a little bit of context for thinking about why the current Congress doesn't work well, or as Senator Grassley pointed out at the beginning of his remarks, why it has difficulty fulfilling some of its basic constitutional responsibilities. I think it's really important to understand the broader political context that motivates both individual senators at the rank and file level and Senate leaders to behave the way we do. And a lot of this will not be new news to all of you, but I think it's a useful starting point for our discussion today. So first, it's worth dwelling for a moment on changes in the makeup of both parties in Congress. Over time, we've seen the distance between the most moderate Republican and the most moderate Democrat grow. To use one particularly timely example, Dan Lipinski, who's a House member from Illinois who won a tough primary last month, is one of, I believe, 3 pro-life Democrats left in the House Democratic Caucus. That's just kind of one data point to indicate how much more aggressively sorted the parties are on certain issues. And in a lot of cases, this just means that it's that much more difficult to build bipartisan compromise. It also means that in the Senate in particular, when you do get things done, they do still tend to be bipartisan, but you end up having to build a much larger coalition. So if you think about the current Senate, Republicans need 9 Democrats to overcome a filibuster, but once you've written a bill that gets those 9 Democrats, chances are you're actually getting more than that. That's sort of a consequence of the polarization, which has made the task of coalition building different than it used to be. It's also worth noting that the electoral experiences of individual members have become much more attached to national political forces, which decreases the incentive to work with members of the opposite party. So in 2016, for example, it was the first time since the advent of the popular election of senators in the early 20th century that every state where there was a Senate election, the state went for the same party in the presidential race as it did selecting a senator. That, again, had not happened since the early 20th century. So voters just aren't splitting their tickets in the same way that they once were, which again decreases the incentives for individual members to try to formulate some sort of independent brand that involves working across party lines. I think what happens with the 10 Democratic senators who are up for re-election this fall in states that President Trump won in 2016 will be an interesting kind of test of whether we're continuing down this path and whether voters are continuing to make a lot of their choices based simply on party identification. We've also seen that since 1980, competition for majority control of Congress has been more or less up for grabs each election cycle. And because of this heightened competition for party control, both parties have an incentive to engage in more of the kind of messaging activity that helps them win elections rather than legislating. This is especially true for minority parties who really don't have an incentive to make the majority party seem like it's capable of legislating. It increases the incentive to put bills on the floor that everyone knows are going to fail, especially under divided government. A majority party might think it's worthwhile to write a piece of legislation that it knows won't become law in order to signal to its voters and, importantly, to come back to something that Senator Grassley mentioned, interest group allies, what it would do if the party had more power following the next election. Beyond these kind of changing electoral circumstances, again, we've seen growing incentives from outside the chamber, particularly for senators, to try and exploit all of their individual procedural rights. So one of my Brookings colleagues, Sarah Binder, and a co-author, started making this argument in the late 90s, but that once interest group allies and external audiences began rewarding individual senators for using obstructive tactics in the chamber, it increased their incentive to do so. So here I think about things like Senator Cruz's filibuster that led to the government shutdown in the fall of 2013, and that is an example of a way that he was incentivized to use the Senate's rules and procedures to help build his reputation. These broader political circumstances have also made it more difficult for members of both parties to unite as a counterbalance to executive power. So in the early 70s, for example, we saw several high-profile pieces of legislation, the Congressional Budget Act, the measure that created the Senate Intelligence Committee to oversee certain executive branch activities. We saw those pass with large bipartisan majorities, in part because senators from both parties saw it as a reason to work together to increase the legislative branch's power at the expense of the executive branch. But as the president has become an increasingly polarizing figure, and I don't mean here just President Trump, I mean the president as an institutional actor has become an increasingly polarizing figure in American politics, it becomes more difficult to build support for an issue on institutional grounds. This is true even in matters that might be ripe for cross-party coalitions, where it can be harder to get things done if the president is too closely identified with an issue. So my favorite example of this comes from 2015, when President Obama was pursuing fast-track trade authority in Congress, and he, mentions in the State of the Union that he would like Congress to pass TPA so he could negotiate the Trans-Pacific Partnership. And during this lobbying effort, it was reported in the press that someone on the staff of then House Ways and Means Chairman Paul Ryan called the White House and said that if they were going to get this done, Obama had to stop asking Republicans to give him anything. That once Republicans felt like they were giving him special authority, that was a much harder sell to make. So merely identifying the issue with the president made it harder to build this kind of legislative coalition. So what does this all mean? So for me, it means that the kind of behavior that we call broken in Congress makes it harder for the chamber to solve the problems facing the country and to fulfill these basic responsibilities of governing. But at the same time, this behavior is the response to incentives that members face. So we either need to find a way to channel those incentives elsewhere or to change the underlying incentives. So I spend a lot of my time thinking and writing about the budget process and the appropriations process, and thinking about how, and Senator Grassley touched on this in his remarks, how the contemporary appropriations process, because we've gotten to a point where basically everyone knows that we're going to end up with an omnibus bill, and that's going to be basically the only thing that moves in a given period of time. That becomes an outlet for all kinds of other political fights. We saw this in January and February with DACA. It's the only train leaving the station, so if you want to have that fight, that's the fight that you have to have the train on. And so the question is, can we figure out a way to ease the process of fulfilling that responsibility of governing, keeping the government's lights on, while finding a different way to let out this partisan steam, if you will, from the steam kettle. But I also think we have to ask ourselves whether individual members are actually interested in taking tough votes or otherwise engaging in the politically difficult work of solving hard problems. We hear a lot of complaints from particularly rank and file members that the legislative process is too centralized, that leaders make too many decisions. But by my read, we see relatively few, not none, but relatively few efforts by individual members to try and use whatever leverage they have to decentralize power within the chambers. And so there's the potential for members to reject the underlying incentive structure that's kind of brought us to where we are. But I at least see relatively little effort by members to actually do that. So I'll stop there, and Kevin, I guess, will go next.
Thanks, Molly. Kevin?
Yes, as Adam mentioned, I do study Congress, and I also enjoy whiskey, and these two phenomena are not unconnected. The subject of Congress and its constitutional duties raises the question of performance. In short, to put an edge to it, is Congress failing? Is Congress doing its job? These questions get battered around a lot in this town and a lot in the media. And I think the common answer is that, yeah, Congress is failing. And certainly if you look at the Gallup polling data, Congress has never had a great level of esteem in the public's eye, but it's been stuck real low for a real long time at historically low levels. So is it the case? Is Congress really failing as an institution? In classic academic fashion, I'm going to say that no, it's not, and yes, it is. And then I'll open it up. We can perhaps take it up on the floor later.
You only get one speaking slot, not two. So you get both of these.
That's right. I'll keep it concise. So, Congress, is it failing? Is it this gridlocked, dreadful place that is just hyper-partisanship, nothing's getting done, posturing, relentless fundraising? That's the image one sometimes takes, particularly if one grazes the media. That's not really that's really not squaring with the basic facts. I mean, sure, there's plenty bad there, but consider one metric: legislation. Since January 2017, Congress has enacted 160 laws. Now, some of that's fluff, post office namings, commemorative coin acts, but there's a lot of real stuff in there too. Certainly, most of us, including most of the American public, are aware of the Omnibus Spending Bill, the Omnibus Tax Act, but there's a whole lot more than that. Just let me give you a few examples. Disaster Tax Relief and Airport and Airway Extension Act, the Raise Family Caregivers Act, Secret Service Recruitment and Retention Act, Emergency Aid to American Survivors of Hurricanes Irma and Jose Act. Congress passes a lot of laws, even when it's supposedly gridlocked and hapless and not interested in legislating. It's doing stuff. And those are not all messaging pieces of legislation. They're real policy. They're places where they're going in and looking and saying, this is a public problem, let's do something. Or here's something that we passed years ago, it's not working that great, let's change it. But none of that stuff tends to get reported in the media because, quite frankly, it's kind of boring. And nobody wants to spend much of their daily time going through congress.gov and seeing what statute was passed the day before or the week before and reading the bills. So the impression we get is that there's nothing's happening down there. But there's plenty happening. Chuck Grassley mentioned nominations. 300 nominees have been confirmed by the Senate since January 2017. 300, it's a sizable number. It's a lot of work to get through these nominees, and that number 300 doesn't even include the various folks who were nominated but didn't get a vote yet. So for example, last week there was a Senate hearing on 3 individuals nominated to be on the board of governors of the U.S. Postal Service. They haven't gotten a vote yet, so that those 3 are not in that number 300, but they will get a vote. Also not included in that number of 300 are the various folks who were nominated or trial ballooned and didn't make it through the process. They washed out, withdrew, or were clearly not going to get confirmed. Another metric of activity. Hearings. Again, not a sexy topic, but hearings are happening with remarkable regularity. Maybe not as often as we would like, but they're happening. Last week I was at a hearing by the House Subcommittee on Legislative Branch Appropriations. Short, the people who control the purse for how much Congress spends on itself. They had a hearing. Chairman, ranking member were sitting there. They were taking notes. They were asking questions. This week they're marking up the bill. They're drafting report language. Governing is happening, but most of us never hear about it unless we are people who are on the Hill on a regular basis. So yeah, I push back against the contention that Congress is clearly failing and nothing is happening down there. But on the other hand, I do agree there are severe problems. I think Congress is failing on some very, very basic metrics, some constitutional metrics. The first of which is the power to tax and spend. When you look at our nation's finances, you will see the aggregation of a series over many, many years of irresponsible decisions. Our debts are terrifyingly large. Our deficits are bad. Politicians obviously have to respond to pluralistic pressures, but when all they do is respond to those pressures and don't think about the national interest and their constitutional duties, this is what you get, a fiscal train wreck, one that's being bequeathed basically to my kids and my kids' kids. So that is a huge failure. Additionally, I would say on the metric of foreign affairs, Congress has a role to play. You look at the Constitution, Congress has things it's supposed to do. Not least is to pass upon, consider the nominees that a president may put up, and to declare war, and to decide what funding will be put to what sort of foreign affairs activities. But for the most part, Congress has increasingly just deferred. Let the president do what he will. And so we find ourselves in this peculiar situation where we're not at war with anyone, yet we're in armed conflicts all over the place. We have intelligence gathering activities going on all over the place, and frequently, most of the Congress, if not nearly all of it, really are not clued into what's going on. The executive branch is just kind of doing what it's doing, and Congress is sitting back and going, And third is more general, the issue of delegation to the executive branch to make tough decisions. The whole apparatus of the administrative state that's been built up over the last century, it keeps getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And Congress, meanwhile, has mostly checked out. They don't pay nearly as much attention as they might to executive branches when they're making rules, making informal rules, engaging in that regulatory black matter that Wayne Cruz likes to talk about. They just let it happen. And then if somebody gets sufficiently outraged and pulls a fire alarm, a trade group or an interest group or somebody else, then they'll say, oh, maybe we should do something about this. Maybe we can back that action off by dropping something into an appropriations bill, which Chuck Grassley points out is harder and harder to do. Or they might use the Congressional Review Act, although that language for 15 years and was utterly unused until about a year ago. So clearly, it's a mixed picture as I see it, but I remain hopeful that as things get increasingly bad on the Hill, we may have a kind of reawakening where people say, like, as a senator did not too long ago, this place sucks. And then get beyond that outrage to actually do something, because each house of Congress can set the rules for its own proceeding. It can fund itself how it wants to. It can run its own shop. It can make things better. It's just a matter of them actually doing it.
Thanks. Yuval?
Well, thank you very much, first of all, for hosting this conversation, Adam, and for bringing us together, and also for bringing Senator Grassley, who offered really the most optimistic take on Congress that I've heard in a very long time. I hope he's right. I appreciate Kevin's yes and no. I am probably closer to Molly's view of how Congress is doing, and we'll build a little bit on what she had to offer in these brief kind of opening remarks. I think that Congress, while it is passing some measures that are a kind of mix of symbolic and unavoidable and minor, is surely failing in some very significant ways. I think that if you measure the standing of Congress and the function of Congress, whether it's by public approval, though as you say that's always low, when you look at public approval of Congress, we're used to saying it's always low, but that doesn't mean it's always 12%. Gallup started measuring public confidence in institutions in 1973, and in that first test, Congress's approval rating was 42%. And people were unhappy with that because that's low, but 42%. Right now, Congress's approval, it doesn't go too far beyond members and their families. And that is a different situation. Or if you think about it in terms of member satisfaction, which I do think is now extremely low. When I worked on the Hill for the House Budget Committee and for the Speaker in the 90s, there were a lot of members who liked their job, and it is hard to find members who like their job at this point. Or if you look at the ability of the Congress to just follow its own rules and get through what it sets up for itself as the structure of how it's supposed to work, I think there are serious problems, and they play out, as you say, Kevin, in a failure to address some key challenges. I would say in a failure to take on tough questions, tough votes. Why is that? I would start, as Molly does, by thinking about member incentives and member choices, and then we'll say just a few words about process. I'd start with member choices and incentives because I think the basic problem is a problem of will. Congress is weak as a constitutional matter because its members want it to be weak. Even if they don't put it that way to themselves or to you when you ask them, ultimately the reason Congress doesn't exert its authority is because members choose over and over not to exert their authority. Part of that is an explicit abdication where they ask the executive branch to do things that they ought to do. I was a policy staffer in the Bush White House. I had the health and veterans and welfare portfolios in the second term, and we would constantly find members coming to us, including Republican members, well, that is to say, including Democratic members, but especially Republican members at the time, coming to us and asking us to do things that they could and should do, and they were not just unpopular things. They were perfectly happy to ask us to do things that would be popular. They could then claim credit for getting the president to do X or Y, and if it didn't work out, well, there goes that president again. He doesn't know what he's doing. And it's much easier to do it that way than to take on the responsibility and the work of making tough decisions themselves. The priority is to avoid tough votes and to avoid giving the other party votes that make them look good, and that becomes very difficult. It then becomes very difficult to do your job as a legislature. That is a big part of what goes on. But I think there's also another facet of it that has to do with the way the members think about the institution. and that actually relates really to the way that a lot of us Americans have come to think about institutions in general. I think that you will find now that members of Congress very often approach the institution as a platform for themselves, as a way to elevate their profile, rather than, on the one hand, as a kind of mold of their activity, that it structures what they do as members of Congress, and ultimately it really structures their character, their place in public life, so that what they do in our politics is shaped by what Congress is and what the legislative process requires of them. There used to be just such a thing as a member of Congress, a human type that was formed by experience in the Congress, and that happens a lot less now. And much more often, members understand themselves as working within a broader political ecosystem in which the advantage that they get by being a member of Congress is that they have an easier time getting on television. And that ecosystem is organized around cable television, and especially in the case of Republicans, talk radio. And that's how they become prominent, that's how they gain status and standing, and what really matters to them is that they're in a position to say what the audience they're speaking to wants to hear, which, by the way, very often is Congress sucks. So they get elected to say that, and they can't wait to get off the floor and go find a camera and say Congress isn't working. And the advantage they get by being elected is that they get a bigger stage, a higher profile. And so they don't actually think of what they're doing as, I wish we could legislate, but X or Y is stopping us. They understand themselves to be playing a role in a much broader political ecosystem where Congress's legislative function just isn't that central. It's not really what it's about. And so their incentives work in such a way that they aren't really trying to legislate. And so it may not be quite fair to say that they're failing to legislate. They're just doing something else that we have to understand better. And I say this reflects a broader set of developments in how we think about institutions, because I actually think that this move from thinking about institutions as molds of character and behavior to thinking of them as platforms for performance is happening across our society. It's very powerfully evident in politics. It surely is what the president does most of the time, and not just this president, though especially so, a performance. It's also a lot of what judges do, a kind of moralistic performance. But I think it helps you understand what's happening in the universities. It helps you understand what's happening in a lot of the professions, to see that we are coming to have a different attitude about what our institutions are for and seeing them as platforms for ourselves. Another part of the reason, though, why members spend so much of their time doing non-legislative things is that they're not actually given that much of an opportunity by the institution to really legislate. And this does get to the ways in which Congress is broken and its processes are fractured. I think that the budget process is at the center of that. In part, the budget process is just at the center of what Congress does, and appropriately so. But it's also the case, it seems to me, that the budget process we have now, the 74 budget process, is especially ill-suited to a moment of intense political polarization, and in a way that exacerbates a lot of the problems that exist in general in our political system, as Molly suggested here, and as she has suggested in a lot of her excellent work on this subject. There's a way in which the 74 process, which starts with a budget resolution, which is really a kind of, well, the resolution itself is just a spreadsheet of numbers, and it's come to be attached to what is ultimately a kind of abstraction about what the majority party wants to do. And so the budget process starts out by allowing the parties to just set out a big vision that's not connected to legislation in any necessary way, and then they spend the rest of the year more or less fighting about that vision. Maybe the minority party puts out its own. Both of them know that this isn't actually going to have to be reflected in legislation. Both of them know that ultimately appropriation is going to be done at the end of the process in a way that isn't going to be the result of a long kind of traditionally legislative process. We also have on the side of that the reconciliation process, which is totally disconnected from budgeting now and is just a way to advance the most partisan of the majority party's priorities. And this has not always been the understanding of what that process is for. I mean, even in in the late 90s, the decision to have advanced, so I didn't work in Congress during the welfare reform debate in 96, but when I was there in 98, the decision to have done it that way, to have advanced welfare reform through reconciliation, remained a controversial choice to have made and affected the way that the Budget Committee thought about its work, that the way that the 97 budget deal worked out. That's entirely gone now, and the reconciliation process is understood as a way to advance especially partisan priorities. And so the budget process as it now exists is a detriment to Congress's functioning on net. And so that obviously should point in the direction of institutional reform, of procedural reform, of budget process reforms. And Congress can do that, although if you talk to members who are frustrated, it can take a long time for them to get to the point where they think that they actually ought to think about changing the process, that this is in their hands. The kind of initiative that Congress showed a few times in its history, maybe most notably for our purposes in 1946 in changing the committee system and changing the budget process, that kind of initiative is not there now. And I think part of the reason for that is that that initiative arose out of a sense that Congress was being defeated in a competition with the executive. And that attitude is not really there now. The sense that there's a struggle for power here and that Congress is losing out and ought to change the way it does things is not there as powerfully as it ought to be. But I also think that behind the broad agreement that there is something wrong, that Congress is failing somehow, that agreement masks a disagreement about what it is that Congress is actually failing to do. Is the purpose of the Congress to enable the majority party to advance its agenda, or is the purpose of the Congress to compel accommodation in a divided society? I think that what you find when people propose reforms of the Congress is that they often combine these two things. And in fact, they're actually quite different purposes. The more kind of parliamentary view of Congress, that its purpose is to let the majority govern while it's the majority and then the public will decide, is in very great tension with the more Madisonian view of Congress, that the purpose is to compel accommodation. And so if and when Congress gets to reforming itself, there will have to be some real debate about what the problem they're trying to solve actually is and what a functional Congress actually would look like.
Well, that was great, everybody. Thank you very much. Before I started in on some more focused questions, I just wanted to tease out a little something that was in your comments, Yuval. When you're talking about the way that members of Congress see themselves, see their jobs, you were touching on points that you brought up recently in National Review, right? You had a piece on how both members of Congress but also the president fundamentally see themselves all as outsiders, right? There's no insiders anymore. Even the president himself and leaders in Congress all seem to stage themselves as standing outside of something and criticizing. Would you mind just sort of elaborating?
Well, you know, it's very much the kind of mood of the moment in our politics, and it has to do with this move in the direction of transformative, of performative institutionalism rather than formative. That is, seeing the institution as a platform for yourself. And you know, a lot of people now get elected to office by being outsiders, by complaining about Washington. And when they get elected, we sort of get to learn what it looks like when the dog catches the car. And what it looks like is the dog just keeps barking and running. And so the president will tweet that the DOJ should have taken X position in court when it took Y position. Well, the DOJ, you know, it works for you. So maybe instead of tweeting this, you could have had a meeting about it. But the attitude is they have done that, and I'll complain about it. This attitude is absolutely pervasive in Congress, where a lot of members spend a lot of their time talking about Congress as if it is something else, rather than thinking about Congress as if it is them. It is what they do. And they hold a share in exercising the legislative authority, a share that, by the way, they really wanted and ran really hard to get. And once they get it, they want nothing to do with exercising it, and instead want to talk about how poorly it's going. This is more of a problem on the Republican side than the Democratic side, but I would say in the last few years, we've definitely seen it increasingly in both parties.
Well, we reached this point for a reason, right? The members and the president are responding to incentives from the public at large. You know, Molly began all of this entire conversation but not with Congress per se, but with the political parties and thus the people and the way that they've sorted. And at a very broad level, I guess, I'm just curious if what we're talking about is really symptoms of the state of the American people, then can there ever really be meaningful reforms in Congress itself, or are we sitting here having sort of a proxy argument over really what's the nature of the American people today? Anybody has any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I go back and forth on this because I like to try and consider myself a generally optimistic person, but like Yuval, I felt like Senator Grassley was as optimistic about Congress as I had heard someone be in quite some time. And I think for me, it really does come down to what are the electoral incentives that members of Congress face. And as long as the electoral incentives are going to encourage them to do the things that they're currently doing, including, as you've all pointed out, talk about how terrible Congress is for political gain, it's really hard for me to see how we get a radical change in the way the institution is functioning.
Kevin, Yuval, is there any thoughts on that?
Sure. Yeah, one of the things I keep wanting to figure out is when the House and Senate as institutions broke down as organizations that socialize new members. Not long ago, I picked up a copy of a book written in the 50s about the Senate that I hadn't read since grad school, and I started thumbing through it, and wow, what a difference. Once upon a time, a legislator would show up here, often by train or car, because there weren't many flights into town, and you would be confronted with an institution that had all sorts of norms, hierarchy, not least amongst them. You learned your place because there were people telling you what your place is and what your role is. We're now in a place that most of that seems to have eroded away, and the sort of norms that exist are not good norms. They seem to be focused on very short-term things. Be a team player for the party, hustle and raise money for the party, don't get too cozy with the people across the aisle. These are various things that just don't foster good governance, and they actually kind of strengthen the incentives that run in the opposite direction, of which there are many. I mean, one obvious difference these days is that there are way more cameras in this town than there were 40 years ago, 60 years ago. It was hard to be a performing SEAL 60 years ago. There just were fewer to perform in front of, and who was here was, you had a much higher percentage of state-based media, big hometown newspapers and that sort of thing. And so, of course, you want to reach your voters, so you would go and you'd hang out with them as a member of Congress and butter them up and boast and this, that, and the other, and you would look good for the hometown folks. You were not performing on the national networks, and you certainly weren't performing on the internet. That's a change, and that's a change that is obviously making governance harder in this town and building what you've always pointed to, the incentives to perform rather than to govern.
So for me, this question is really, it comes down to the distinction between optimism and hope. I'm not an optimist. I'm a conservative, first of all. But optimism is just the expectation that things will go well. Well, that's silly. But I think hope is something different. Hope is the belief that the resources are there for things to go well. And hope makes you active, not passive. I think that there are ways to improve the situation, and that they could start from the premise that surely guided the framing of our Constitution, which was not that the people are great, so let's create institutions to reflect their greatness, but was that institutions can channel incentives in ways that overcome the deficiencies of democracy. Now, you do that in order to empower what's good about democracy. The system has to be answerable to the people, but it has to also recognize that there are ways in which that can lead in bad directions. And so you create structures, you create institutions, you create rules and norms that try to channel democratic energies in ways that are also constructive institutionally. And I do think that kind of thinking could help Congress a lot. And that points in the direction of trying to think about, given this situation, given polarization, which was not at this level the last time Congress thought about how to organize itself, given the nature of the modern media, how do we set up rules and processes so Congress can work? I think the point that Kevin makes is absolutely essential to this. A lot of the reason why Congress is so performative now is that everything is televised. And that's done in the name of transparency, and transparency is a good thing, but we treat it as an unalloyed good, and it has costs too. Every institution needs to have an inner life, needs to have some sanctum where people think together, people who are defined only by their commitment and membership in that institution think together. And Congress has not enough inner life. It's had to back away from every space where it could have thought as the cameras have entered that space, and all you can do in that space is perform. And so you got to back out and back out further, to the point where the only place you can think now really is just in the Speaker's office at 11 p.m. on the day before the money runs out. And that's where Congress thinks and legislates. So you have to think a little bit about the costs of total transparency and think about whether there are ways to allow Congress to have some more sanctum, some more spaces for an inner life.
Well, let's focus, before we go to audience questions, on two very specific procedural or structural reforms in Congress, and they both came up in the conversation with Senator Grassley. The first one is the filibuster. When I for a long time, I thought the filibuster was good and important and needed to remain in place. Now, especially now that I spent my time researching and working on administrative state issues, I wonder if the filibuster just doesn't keeps creating a policy vacuum at the national level that the administrative agencies just rush in to take over. I'd be curious, what are your current views, all of you, on the filibuster, and whether it's time for reform or total abolition, or just keep it as it is?
I mean, my current perspective on this is that I think at the end of the day, well, yes, the filibuster makes it harder to legislate at the national level, and certainly one consequence of that is more power ending up vested in the administrative state. If you don't agree on what you would do in the absence of the filibuster policy-wise, the filibuster isn't actually your problem. And so I think that this has been on display in the last 15 months, that, there are things that the Republican majority in Congress wanted to try and do that they were unsuccessful at doing because they didn't agree on what they wanted those things to be, the need to get to 60 votes notwithstanding. And so I'm thinking about things like the healthcare bill. Like they didn't agree on what they wanted that to look like. And so they, even without the need to overcome the threat of a filibuster, they couldn't accomplish that legislative goal. And so I think focusing exclusively on what the filibuster means for outputs has a tendency to mask underlying disagreement about what you think those outputs should be.
Anybody else?
I would just throw in that Chris DeMuth wrote a very persuasive article about, the Senate is insufficiently 21st century. The filibuster is part of it, and that the separation of powers problem gets worse because the Senate cannot be energetic and fast enough about what it does. So, as Adam suggested, falls further and further behind the administrative state. I agree with that. The concern I have is that the Senate is supposed to be a deliberative body. And certainly the filibuster and such things are being abused to just throw sand in the gears. But if we get rid of that stuff, aren't we basically green-lighting majorities to fully disregard the minority and become less deliberative and become more parliamentary in behavior, which I am concerned that's not going to play out well over the long run.
So I'm sort of an extremist on this. I would enact a filibuster in the House before I would ever get rid of the filibuster in the Senate. I think the filibuster is especially valuable now, precisely because of some 21st century realities, and especially because of polarization. So whereas what can get 50 votes changes just about every election, what can get 60 votes actually doesn't change that much. And Congress needs now to understand itself as geared toward finding those accommodations that can get 60% of the Congress to vote for them. That's an answer to polarization. That's a way to keep polarization from putting us in a kind of endless tug of war where the only thing Congress does is reverse what the last Congress did, which is what happens a lot of times in the presidency. I think most of what has happened in the administration in the last year and a half has basically been a reversal of roughly the last year and a half of the Obama administration. That can't really be actually how we govern ourselves. And so I think the filibuster is enormously important now. And that is rooted ultimately in my sense that the purpose of the Congress really is to compel accommodation, not just to empower majorities. And so a lot of the dissatisfaction that members have now has to do, it seems to me, with a disconnect between the House and Senate. So the House will just pass hundreds of bills, and then they get frustrated. We passed all this great stuff, but all our voters think we're not doing anything because nothing gets through the Senate. One way to solve that is to make the Senate more like the House, but I actually think that we need some restraints on the pure majoritarianism of the House, because that ultimately undermines the kind of role that Congress can play in helping a society as divided as ours govern itself.
Now, the other mechanism I had in mind was the power of the purse, which Senator Grassley touched on. We've already touched on our remarks, and I was interested in the Q&A. Dan raised the question of earmarks, right? As earmarks would certainly restore a lot of power back to Congress relative to the executive branch, and Senator Grassley sort of shied away from that. And so I'd be curious for your thoughts in general, not just on earmarks, but on the general structure of the way that Congress funds our government and uses or doesn't use that mechanism as a tool for its in service of its broader powers. You know, what reforms would you support or oppose?
So I think we need to have a much broader conversation about what we want the appropriations process to be before we can answer the question of what process do we write to get us to that point. And questions like how important is deliberation versus timeliness? Where do we think the deliberation should occur? Are we comfortable with a process where there's pretty substantial deliberation, but it only happens in the appropriations committees and then not so much on the floor, which would be a process that's kind of geared towards producing an omnibus explicitly? And I just don't think we've had that set of conversations. And that's where I would start, is to sort of really reevaluate what do we want the process to be and what do we value in the process.
Well, I'm glad that in the omnibus, one of the provisions tucked in there was the creation of a joint committee on budget reform. You know, both House and Senate have to get together and start talking about this topic, which I can't remember the last time they actually convened to discuss it. The House has been plenty busy doing budget reform discussions, but if anything's going to get done, it's got to have both chambers. So I'll be keeping an eye on that to see how that proceeds. I myself feel like, you know, it's indisputable that the 74 Budget Act needs to be scrapped, and we have to move towards something that is simpler and more in keeping with the nature of Congress as a messy, deliberative body. The 74 Act really kind of modeled itself on a kind of executive hierarchical organization mentality with these rational processes by which you would have these guys draft a resolution, but the resolution can only be approved if everybody else kind of consents to it, and then activities would flow logically, you know, beneath that resolution, which would bind the total outputs, et cetera, et cetera. It just hasn't worked. And as the budget has grown more enormous and as entitlements have taken up a huger and huger portion of total spending, you know, was it 60+%, 65+% now? We got to rethink things, and I would think that to some degree disaggregating so that more members feel like they actually have a say in spending as opposed to being spectators in the process. I think something along that lines would be valuable.
Yeah, I would very much build on that. I think disaggregating actually needs to be the key to how Congress thinks about reforming it. So it consolidated itself in the last several rounds of reforms to become more like the executive, but I think it now needs to become more like a legislature. And that would mean a formal budget process that actually looks more like earmarking, so that earmarks are not this kind of barely legitimate way of getting around the nature of the process so you can get things funded, but a budget process that involves many more smaller bills rather than a few large bills, so that Congress is legislating most of the time. And I think that it would make sense to think about blurring the line, if not eliminating the line, between authorization and appropriation, which in the absence of formal earmarks doesn't make as much sense. So that a committee that authorizes and appropriates would be able to legislate smaller bills on an ongoing way, and the other function of Congress, the oversight function, would then be dealt with by a separate set of committees. That would be a big change, but I think a change that could be more in keeping with what Congress needs to do now and how it needs to change. It can wrestle power back by making the process of governing more legislative. I don't think it can wrestle power back by making it look more like executive power. Congress is just never going to be able to compete with the executive on executive function. I mean, that should be obvious.
I just want to throw in that your point on authorization and appropriation, I mean, right now, it's hard to tell them apart. I mean,
Yeah.
we appropriate money for agencies that aren't authorized to actually have it. That happens as a matter of course.
Yep.
Every year, CBO puts out a report on that. We appropriate and we include authorization language telling agencies what to do. It's not just here's some money, spend it on this and this and this, but we're actually telling them how to do through appropriations. I mean, Molly's made a great point that so much of governing now, what we used to think of as authorizations and policy making is occurring through the appropriations process, because that's the main vehicle, and it's this massive thing in which anybody can kind of jam in and dump provisions without a whole lot of scrutiny. So yeah, why do we authorize and appropriate separately when clearly Congress does not want to do that?
I think there's a more general logic there where we should look at what Congress is doing now, much of which, given the formal process, is dysfunction, and ask ourselves, if this is what Congress wants to do, what does a process that does this as the appropriate work of the Congress look like? If this is what members think they need to do now, then what is the budget process supposed to be? I think it would look very different from what the process is.
Well, with that, why don't we open the floor to audience questions? There's still a microphone in the room. If anybody has any questions, we'll start in the third row, and then in the Joe Postel in the second from the back.
Thank you. I'm Ted Hurt. I'm a retired Department of Justice attorney. Panel alluded only generally to the issue of money, and a frequent question raised in Washington has been, oh, well, money is the problem because members of Congress are always raising money, therefore they're not legislating. I wondered if the panel agrees with that premise. I could go one step further and say, well, if money is the problem, what is the solution? But campaign finance is so complicated, maybe we don't want to go there.
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, the right question to ask is this one about how much of their time are members actually devoting to fundraising activities, because at the end of the day, there are only so many hours in the day, and time used to do one thing is not time to use to do something else. I don't have a great kind of empirical sense of whether I think that's true, but I think it's the right thing to think about, is that and this goes back to Yuval's point about how members of Congress worked really hard to get to be members of Congress. The sort of missing and I think at the end of his comment is, and they spent a lot of money to get there. They raised a lot of money to get there. And so I think to the extent that that's happening, it is something we should worry about. And I don't have a great answer to what we do about it, but I think thinking about what are the incentives to allocate your time across tasks is the right thing to ask.
But let me just add, before Kevin, you jump in, how do you go about getting the money out of politics when the politics leads to the government that controls, spends, and otherwise influences enormous sums of money? I mean, how do you get the money out of, what's the cliche, how do you get the money out of politics without getting the politics out of money?
Sure.
Kevin?
Well, yeah, I think on the Hill, there's some recognition that this is more and more of a problem, and there's been bipartisan legislation introduced which would forbid fundraising during the work week, because members get tired of, like, oh man, it's 1 o'clock, I have to go tromp over to the DNC headquarters and go sit in a cubicle and make calls. This doesn't feel dignified. This is not fun. Is this what being a legislator means? So there could be some effort at self-binding, but the problem is that if you do that, it then spills over elsewhere. Okay, fine, if I'm not going to do 3 hours of fundraising today, I guess I have to do them on the weekend. Or maybe we'll fly into town on Tuesdays and then fly out on Wednesdays so we can go back and raise money. Figuring that out is messy stuff. One thing that I keep wondering about, and somebody who's a campaign finance expert would have to tell me, is that I've got the sense that perhaps members of Congress think raising money is a bit more important than it actually is. There's a whole industry out there that aims to rake in a lot of bucks by getting members of Congress to raise money and then pay them to craft messages and do this, that, or the other. And what little research I've nosed into on this has been very inconclusive about how much of it's actually effective. And I guess I wonder if at some point in time we have enough evidence to show that you're really chucking a dart by spending this amount of time, huge amounts of time raising money, that maybe members will be like, I'm not going to spend that much time because honestly I don't like doing it. But who knows?
Well, they certainly don't like doing it. So this is the biggest quality of life complaint that members make. They all talk about it. And as you say, they have to walk over to the party committee and sit in this cubicle, and somebody at some point, some member with a sense of humor put up a copy of the Constitution in the little cubicle where the House members sit and make calls, and it depresses them to sit there and contrast. I think that first of all, the question of whether it's worth raising all that money is a hugely important question. They certainly think so, and their opponents think so, and so it's hard to argue with them. I do think that there's a role for the parties in helping them out of this jam that is probably underappreciated. The political parties are another set of institutions that have really been transformed, among other things, by transparency and by this way of thinking about parties as platforms rather than as institutions. They too really lack an inner life, and they've been constrained by campaign finance laws in ways that are very peculiar. The parties could help members raise money. That is, they could raise money for members if they were allowed to do it to a much greater degree than they are now. And that's their purpose, whereas it's not really the purpose of a member of Congress to spend all their time raising money. So that I would favor some changes in campaign finance laws that move in the direction of allowing the parties to raise much more money and spend it much more freely, but then constraining both what members and what outside groups can do in the ways they do now. I think that there's going to be an institution that raises money for partisan politics, and those ought to be the parties rather than Congress, which it more or less is now.
I think another thing that is difficult for getting us out of the current situation, if that's where we want to go, is the degree to which expectations about fundraising have become a tool for party leaders to try and keep individual rank and file members in line or reward them for fulfilling expectations or punish them for not fulfilling expectations. So to the extent that fundraising is also a piece of the overall internal politics of each party on the Hill is another thing to keep in mind.
We'll ask a couple more. Joe in the third row, and then Jimmy in the back row, and then Steve.
There's sort of a great paradox in this explanation for what's happened to Congress, and I don't know what to make of it, so I'm hoping that you'll be able to shed some light on it for me. The background explanation for what's happened in the electorate, polarization, party sorting, all of that sort of thing, does seem to have a huge power in explaining what's going on in Congress today. But the last time we saw this was the late 19th century, and the consequence of that was what we would have predicted, sort of responsible party government, really strong leaders in the House. They called them czars back then. And yet, when we see all of that happening today, we're not getting the same results. I mean, what we would expect is strong majoritarian government and strong leadership in Congress. And to some extent, people say that's what is going on. But it seems strange to talk about Paul Ryan and Mitch McConnell as czars in the old 19th century sense, or to talk about parties today as cohesive and enacting their majoritarian agendas efficiently. So in a sense, we sort of have all of the effects we would expect of polarization, yet when we try to put it into practice, that doesn't seem to be happening. And that's a broad question, I suppose, to ask, but is there any way of making sense of this paradox, or is it not a paradox? Or are we really on one side or the other of this question? I think that's sort of the really interesting thing I'd like to hear you just talk about a little bit more.
So I think one thing to keep in mind is when we ask ourselves whether, Ryan and McConnell are strong party leaders, do we mean that, or do we expect that strong party leaders would be able to get things done, or do we expect them to prevent things that their electoral bases would not like from happening? And so this is a distinction between sort of positive power and negative power. And I think that much of what we see in terms of behavior by both majority party leaders in Congress right now is really aggressive exercise of negative power. And I think that only gets you so far. You kind of can't build a durable governing coalition on negative agenda power alone. And I think by my mind, that's part of what is leading Ryan to decide to retire. But I think that's an important distinction. And so I see a lot of negative power. I don't see that much positive power.
Yeah, it'd be fun to go back and look at the czar era. My immediate sense is that, yeah, we have seen a very hierarchical structure be put in the House and the Senate. That senator saying this place sucks was complaining specifically about the fact that he'd been here for 18 months or something and hadn't been allowed to offer a single amendment. And I think that illustrates one difference between now versus then, which is back then there were still, you may have czars, but you also, as a czar, could give people a lot of stuff. I have on my shelf back in my office a volume about this thick, and it's a bound congressional hearing where they were hashing out what the salaries should be paid to various postmasters around the United States and other people who work there. Like, hey, that's giving people something that they can take home. That sort of thing here is just not around now. So that's a tool that's been taken away, and that kind of goes back to the question of, okay, well, do we need to give them earmarks or something like that? And I also think, to go back to Yuval's thesis about performative, I mean, again, back then, there was what happened in D.C. mostly stayed in D.C. It was like Vegas. And so, the ability to cut all sorts of deals at the micro level, to satisfy various pluralistic interests and to keep members of Congress in line on that count, it's just really hard to do that now.
I agree with all of that. I think the one thing I would add is that we're seeing polarization in a fragmenting society. 19th century America was in a lot of ways a consolidating society, late 19th century America. All the institutions were getting bigger and more consolidated. What we're seeing now is intense partisanship alongside very weak parties. And that sort of pattern between the ethos and the institutions repeats itself over and over when you think about a lot of our governing institutions. And so I think this is a distinct kind of problem. And it's a problem that requires us to think institutionally. The when we think about the situation of contemporary America, we think first about the forces that are buffeting our society, and we think this creates this huge crisis for us. I think our country, even in fairly recent memory, say in the 1970s, was buffeted by much stronger, much more dangerous forces that could much more easily have destroyed everything. The difference now is not those forces. The difference now is that the underlying institutions are weaker than they were. And the work that needs to be done is the work of reinforcing institutions. And a lot of our conversation, even conversation about renewal, about revitalization, is more about ethos than about institutions. And that balance needs to change if we're really going to solve these problems.
Well, thank you for a great conversation. You mentioned electoral incentives, and I wanted to talk specifically about the primary process. And I like to think of sort of Roy Moore's win in the primary elections as sort of the caricature of the process, and how that drives our representatives away from the median voter and towards the more extreme party base, because that's who actually shows up to vote in these elections. So I wonder if you have any thoughts on sort of reforming the primary process as a way to maybe get Congress to stop being so partisan, if that is, in fact, the problem. Thanks.
So I think there's some emerging evidence that suggests that primary voters may not actually be all that different than general election voters. I think that we're starting to, some folks are trying to start unpacking the degree to which that's actually true. I guess for me the biggest question is, well, if not the current primary system, what would we do instead, and what would be where would we go instead of what we have? I mean, I do think that we have to examine what the consequences are, but I'm not sure that I can imagine a solution that involves big changes to the primary process.
It's the primary situation's a bit like what I suspect about the desire to raise money. The fear way exceeds the probability. Human beings, we know, have trouble understanding probabilities. They get terrified of things that are fantastically unlikely, yet do things which are terrifically risky on a regular basis. And in the case of primaries, I mean, I believe the data show that the likelihood of somebody being primaried is actually pretty low. Yet politicians way overimagine the possibility of it. I mean, it's like when Cantor got knocked off, it was like, holy moly, everybody's got to double down, everybody's got to raise more money, as opposed to going, well, yeah, sometimes lightning does hit. We don't all have to go out and put lightning rods on our roofs. Maybe it's prudent, but
it's required by law.
Panicked reaction. So, you know, again, I'm kind of curious, like, I take a market perspective on a lot of things, is like, if the facts are at odds and the price is at odds with the value of the good, is some point is the market going to get smarter and correct? So far it hasn't, I don't think, unfortunately. I don't know what that says about the participants in the market, but one would hope over time.
Yuval, last word?
Well, I agree with that. I think members vastly overstate the degree to which they are in danger all the time. I don't have a good alternative to the primary process for Congress. I think the presidential primaries could use a lot of changes, and you have to think about the very different purpose they serve for a party. But I think, frankly, Roy Moore was probably just attractive to a lot of Republican voters in his state. I'm not sure that you could design a process that would change that fact. And so surely there are ways to improve it. Surely there are particular instances where it could be improved. But I suspect that, like money, it's probably overstated as a cause of the problems we have.
Well, I sense slightly less optimism from this part of the discussion than from our discussion with Senator Grassley. But thanks to all of you for joining us today, and thank you to all of our speakers.